You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. On today's episode, I offer a warm welcome back to the marvellous Ken Gerhard. As an author, researcher, lecturer, animal educator, and with numerous television appearances under his belt, Ken has years of experience in the worlds of the weird. After a hectic 2022, Ken updates us on the expedition searching for giant salamanders in California, his visit to Bluff Creek, some up-to-date Bigfoot reports from Texas, and we discuss the Beast of Gevaudan and some of the theories that have been put forward over the years. As always, it's a pleasure to speak to Ken, but before that, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by going to patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as always. Mysteries and Monsters is across whichever social media platform you wish to use. Just search for Mysteries and Monsters. You can also go to mysteriesandmonsters.com for news, episodes, and merchandise. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr from the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So, let's catch up with Ken as we look into some unusual cryptid conundrums from around the world. On today's show, it's a very warm welcome back to one of my most popular guests, Ken Gerhard. An author, investigator, lecturer and researcher, Ken has chased down cases across continents. With a lifelong love of all things cryptid and high strangeness, Ken has investigated some of the most intriguing cases in the realms of Forteana. Ken, welcome back.
Hello, Paul. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, and it's probably my fault I've not reached out prior to this, but going on your summer booking schedule, Ken, you would have been hard-pressed to have fitted me in, I think.
Oh, well, yeah, it was a busy year for sure, particularly during the summer. I was traveling virtually every weekend. But I do keep tabs on you on social media, Paul, and I saw that the quality of guests was outstanding. I saw a lot of my friends and colleagues and respected peers kind of doing interviews on your show. So all is good. Thank
you very much. So I know obviously COVID really kind of knocked the conference scene on its backside, sort of 2020, 2021, Ken. You've been all over the States this year, and you've been up to Minnesota, you've been out to West Virginia, you've been in Tennessee, you've been in Alabama. Would you say that, as someone that's done the conferences pre-COVID, that there seems to have been a bigger appetite, or people are just more enthusiastic to come back now that there seem to be a whole range of them back up for 2022? Yeah, well,
obviously the conferences you're referring to are either generally Bigfoot or sort of cryptid related, or sometimes paranormal and UFO type stuff. So I think in recent years it feels like the popularity of these events has been growing at a steady clip. Of course, there was a setback primarily during 2020. I think I canceled virtually all of my events that year. I had one or two that we managed to pull off, but last year actually came back pretty strong as well. I think once some of the restrictions were being lifted and people became more comfortable, vaccinated and stuff, we had probably about 15 events last year that I attended, and then this year I think it was like 17. So, but they've been well attended, and the enthusiasm seems to be there. So, certainly a lot of fun traveling. I enjoy doing lectures on a variety of topics, and I really just enjoy meeting people and, hearing about their experiences or, getting fresh perspectives and what have you.
I think you're quite unique in some respects, Ken, because you've got such an expertise across a variety of different cryptids. You're always invited to talk about a variety of subjects. Do you think that helps when you're looking at the conference circuit? Because obviously you can cover Bigfoot and Dogman. I know you've done the Mothman Festival as well, along with some other paranormal things as well. So do you, as you said there, it does seem to me, looking from the outside in, that these events just keep growing year on year now?
Yeah, absolutely. And, to be frank, I mean, Bigfoot is still the rock star. There are far more Bigfoot conferences in the cryptid world than any other type of cryptid, and they're very well attended. I know, there are at least a couple I can think of that have been going on for 20 plus years. They're still very well attended. I know that in recent years there have been conferences that have sprung up in places like Tennessee and even Nebraska, believe it or not, where you've had well over 1,000 people in attendance.
Wow.
So Bigfoot certainly draws anything with Bigfoot on it. Certainly draws, I think, the largest audience. But I generally like to stick with Bigfoot if I've got a topic that I think will appeal to the audience. But as you mentioned, since I do investigate a range of different cryptids, sometimes that comes in handy, and I like to be kind of the odd man out, if you will, and do a conference or do a lecture about the Loch Ness Monster or Chupacabra, Thunderbirds, or whatever. And I think that the Bigfoot crowd is obviously receptive to those, and it kind of mixes things up a little bit. Because it is kind of fun to have that little change up at a conference every now and then when you have a little bit of variety. So
yeah. Well, the last time we spoke, as we mentioned there, as you touched on, was when you'd released your guide to the Loch Ness Monster 18 months ago, Ken. Mm-hmm. And at that point, you mentioned that you were looking forward to heading off to California on the hunt for a very intriguing case revolving around giant salamanders. And one thing I've always appreciated about your work, Ken, is that you understand that the term cryptid does not necessarily just refer to creatures we hope exist. It's usually creatures that are either extinct and people are still reporting them, such as the thylacine, or creatures that exist in other parts of the world, and yet we have reports of them in places where they shouldn't be. And it seems that, for me, the giant salamander seems very similar to the ones that are reported in Asia, but obviously I think in the US, your biggest salamander that you're supposed to have is the hellbender, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. The hellbender is in the eastern US, and sadly it faces a lot of amphibians around the planet right now. It's vulnerable due to habitat loss and climate change and things like that. But the alleged giant salamanders of the Pacific Northwest is kind of a fascinating cryptid. At least I've always thought it was a fascinating cryptid that was often referenced in some of the classic Bigfoot literature, books by John Green and Ivan Sanderson, and some of those Bigfoot classics would often have these kind of sidebar stories where they would talk about researchers and investigators hearing about these monstrous salamanders. And you're right. What were described in these stories were salamanders in the range of anywhere from 5 to up to 9 feet long, which would certainly at least rank them with the giant Chinese and Japanese salamanders of Asia. But also much larger than that, and perhaps something more along the lines of a prehistoric specimen from the Carboniferous period or something. So, but the accounts go back at least to the 1920s, and there was a guy named Frank Griffith, and he was in the Trinity Alps, is a beautiful old forest old growth forest in Northern California. And Frank Griffith claimed that he saw 5 giant salamanders, 5 to 9 feet long, in the New River in the Trinity Alps back in the 1920s. And then I think about 20 years later, a guy named Vern Hardin was at a place called White's Lake or Hubbard Lake in that same Trinity National Forest area, where he claims he saw and actually managed to hook an 8 or 9 foot salamander that was kind of sitting on the bottom of a pond or this lake. And he was not able to reel it in. But, those are just a couple of the stories, and they've periodically appeared throughout the years. Not so many that I'm aware of in recent years, but, I'm not local. I'm obviously here in Texas. And so that's why we connected with a local guy named Jamie Wayne from the Bluff Creek Bigfoot Project, and he was kind of fascinated in that topic as well. And so we kind of put our organization together with him as kind of the logistics guy and the boots on the ground that could kind of, make it all happen there. So
yeah. So how long was the expedition designed to run for then, Ken? Because I know there was about 4 or 5 of you that went out there, and hopefully there's a documentary coming down the line, because I know you filmed a lot of your research and your work at that period while you were looking out for it. So how long were you out there in the Trinity Forest?
Well, admittedly, we were only out there for about a week, and a lot of that was just because we were this was our kind of a self-funded expedition. We did a GoFundMe, and we had some very generous benefactors, but all of us have jobs and obligations. So 4 of us took off from Texas, Oklahoma, and keep in mind that we drove all the way to Northern California, which was about a 30-some-hour drive. So even though we broke that up, that was quite an ordeal. And then we were on the ground there for a few days in the Trinity National Forest. The expedition was pretty cool in terms of, I think in terms of collaboration, but also kind of all of us working together. We had a wildlife biologist on the team. We had a guy that is an animal handler at zoos that trains elephants and stuff. So we had a lot of specialists there. We had a journalist, kind of videographer there. And yes, there will be a documentary coming, hopefully, once we are able to find the time to put that together. But, the habitat we're talking about here, Paul, this is obviously an elevation, small mountains. There are a lot of cold water, fast running streams that sort of come down the mountains, from the glacial lakes kind of higher up. The water is very shallow, but it's, very cold and fast moving. It's very rocky habitat. And, I did consult with some, field biologists who had done salamander surveys in Asia looking for giant salamanders there. And we basically deployed the same techniques, which is kind of sweeping through these shallow waters, reaching under rocks, because that's where, giant salamanders will generally go under a rock or a down log or something like that. So just a lot of kind of poking our hands into areas. Noodling. Yes, exactly. And we had a number of underwater cameras that we deployed, including an ROV, and we were netting. And so, it was kind of it was a fun, it was kind of different, a departure from your traditional cryptid research, which I guess most people would view as Bigfoot research, where you're out in the woods at night, banging on trees and, calling out and using night vision and things. So it was, unfortunately, we did not find any cryptid or unknown species of giant salamanders. We did find some specimens of Pacific giant salamanders, which sounds a little misleading, but the Pacific giant salamanders, and I can't think of the Latin name off the top of my head, are not that big. I mean, they get to be like 8 to 12 inches long typically. And there are vague accounts of people finding like 18-inch specimens, like freakishly large ones, but still nothing approaching the size of these legendary cryptid giant salamanders that we'd all heard about. And I should add one last thing too, is that Jamie Wayne, who again is from this area, works in the Bluff Creek Bigfoot Project, has, sort of connections to different local native tribes. I think you have the Hoopa tribe up there. I think the Yurok is another tribe, but all of these native people in that area do have sort of native traditions that may refer to these giant salamanders as well. The translation of the name, which I can't pronounce, is called the Long Ones, and they're said to be these long serpentine animals that live in creeks. And of course, they are, as with many legendary beasts, they're kind of adorned with super superpowers, that they and malevolent intentions that they want to snatch kids off riverbanks and things like that. But there could be a basis of truth there as well. So all in all, a pretty fascinating mystery, Paul.
So what are they like because I've often found this really interesting when you come to certain native nations up there, Ken, that a lot of them have these tales of large serpentine creatures of a variety of descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a similar thing? I know obviously you're in California, so that the ecology and the environment would tend to sort of suggest that, there are going to be snakes further down the state. But when you're getting up towards the Pacific Northwest, is it somewhere that seems to be less hospitable for reptiles in general?
Well, that's true. But you do have a few exceptions. There are timber rattlers up there in California, Oregon. I don't know if they range as far north as Washington. They most certainly have probably species of rat snakes and water snakes and garter snakes up there. But they're certainly not as abundant as in the southern U.S., southwest and southeast. But you're right. That does seem to be a prevalent Native American legend here in North America, that there are these gigantic serpentine water beasts. They are often depicted as having horns, which is interesting. I don't know where that comes from, but the notion of the horned serpent, very prevalent in some of the Algonquin traditions of, around New York and, Lake Champlain, for example, where we have Lake Champlain monster. There are pre-existing stories of these horned serpents. So don't know what to make of it really, Paul. It's just a fascinating coincidence, if nothing else, that all of these different widespread disparate tribes talk about these sort of nefarious serpentine water creatures that are, sort of viewed as legends, I guess.
Yeah, I know I've heard recently a couple of people sort of trying to drag Ogopogo into this as well, which isn't too far from that particular area, in regards to aligning that with that kind of similar thing, that once again you've got Native American and First Nation tribes who have these history of giant serpentine creatures.
Yes.
And we've also got what we would consider to be a lake monster.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's nothing for these people to have any point of reference to, Ken. And that's why I always find these particular aspects of the law fascinating, because really you can't say, oh, well, it's because they know about snakes, because they clearly didn't know about snakes because they weren't there.
Yeah, that's true. And, the thing to keep in mind is that, and I'm glad you mentioned Ogopogo. The native name there was Nahatik, and it was kind of originally described as a giant serpentine thing. Just because we're just calling them serpents or interpreting them as serpents does not necessarily mean that they are, true reptilian serpents or snakes. We could, in fact, be dealing with animals that merely have a serpentine form or shape. So, for example, in my Loch Ness book, I referenced the theory about basilosaurs or archaeocetes, which were relatively serpentine whales compared to the modern whales that we know and love. Back again, hundreds of millions of years ago, there were enormous serpentine amphibians. And of course, there are, modern serpentine amphibians as well that are habitually aquatic. But, you had some real monsters back hundreds of millions of years ago, like Erogyrinus, which was, I think, like a 15-foot. The embolomirs, they were these giant serpentine amphibians. So there, you have, through convergent evolution, you occasionally have animals that have similar forms and shapes. And so just, the notion that we have these stories and traditions of quote unquote serpents should not negate the possibility that we're dealing with a different type of animal that just, merely looks serpentine.
I think the difficulty as well, when you've gone on an expedition looking for a salamander, as you've referred to earlier there, Ken, when we're dealing with the normal species, they seem to be under real pressure anyway. So when you're looking for something that is reportedly 3 times as large as the largest ones currently found in the States, you've got to deal with the ecological impacts that they're having to face with, as well as the fact that a lot of the reports, as you mentioned there, are from 50, 60, 70 years ago. So it could be one of those awful situations where perhaps they were there, but unfortunately we're just too late to try and find them. Yes,
that would be the tragedy, of course. And, I've noticed, I'm sure many people have noticed this in recent years, but a lot of my favorite fresh watering holes, rivers, lakes, ponds, creeks, here in North America, the water levels are substantially lower. And, the Earth's climate is warming up, and that is resulting in a lot of these kind of spots drying up or water levels going down. And that would certainly pose a huge risk to any type of large aquatic animal that is, supposedly inhabiting these different waterways. So, hopefully we can, prove that some of these things might be real. Time is working against us, of course. I think that you could make a strong argument that there are still sort of credible accounts and reports that are coming in around the globe, certainly from Loch Ness still and Lake Champlain and Okanagan, but other places as well. And but you're right. I work with the San Antonio Zoo, Paul, and very proud of our involvement in species survival plans and conservation, but virtually every animal that we have on exhibit in the zoo is at least vulnerable, with a few exceptions, and many are either endangered or critically endangered due to just, the massive habitat loss around the world.
Yeah. Well, it's affecting everywhere. Obviously, this year here in the UK, we had our hottest day ever recorded, Ken, over 40 degrees for the first time ever.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, that's hard to believe.
Yes, it certainly smashed records. It was one of those where they'd broken records before we'd even hit midday. As soon as the sun came up, that was it. Records were falling.
And you guys don't have a lot of air conditioning there in there in England. Is that true, Paul?
Yes.
Most folks are not used to having to crank on an air conditioner. So
no, it's the kind of thing where you have to go to your local supermarket and stand in the freezer aisle, Ken.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'd be doing.
That's as good as it gets. Eat lots of ice lollies. But also, I know you had a lovely sort of bookend to this trip as well, that you managed to get down to Bluff Creek, didn't you not?
Oh, yes. That was definitely the cherry on the cake. Is the last 2 days that we were up there, Jamie took us up to the film site, the Patterson-Gimlin film site. Of course, it's been a lifelong dream of mine to go there. We also got to visit Willow Creek, which is still, of course, home to the famous China Flat Bigfoot Museum, which has a fairly impressive collection of Bob Titmus's Bigfoot casts, other researchers. We saw the famous Jim McLaren Bigfoot statue, and there's still a lot of Bigfoot-related businesses there, hotels and things. But, yeah, going to the film site and camping at Louse Camp, which is close to the film site, which is where many of the legendary Bigfoot researchers from John Green, Tom Slick, Peter Byrne, Renee DeHinden, Jerry Crew, all those guys were out there at one time or another, mostly in the late 1950s, early 60s, kind of camping out. And of course, Patterson and Gimlin as well. So that was significant. I'm very impressed with the job that the Bluff Creek project has done since the rediscovery of the film site really happened in about 2010 to 12, I believe.
Yeah.
The film site had kind of been lost over the years, and there were, a number of researchers that went down there and declared, oh, this is the spot, or this is the spot based on how it looked. But the film site has actually changed quite a bit through the years. When the film was shot, and of course, I'm sure all your listeners are familiar with the iconic footage that was shot on October 20th, 1967 at Bluff Creek. There had been a recent ravaging flood just a few years earlier, and it had really kind of flattened a lot of the trees and displaced a lot of things. So it was kind of more of a clearing, this particular location. But when we visited it last year, it had really grown up, and there were a lot of saplings. Vegetation had come back. The creek has actually kind of moved or meandered a couple of 100 yards to the south. But still, they've been able to determine a lot of the old trees, stumps, and landmarks from that film 50 some years ago are still there, believe it or not. And, that can be verified. And so I actually got to squat down where Patterson, they figured out where Patterson was squatting when he filmed it. I got to walk Patty's trajectory. And so it was important just to get kind of an idea of distance, I think, more than anything else, scale and distance. And, something that's very difficult to determine by looking at a film. But when you're actually there on the ground, you realize, for example, how close Roger Patterson was to this creature, at least, at the closest point was probably only maybe 30 to 50 yards away. It looks much farther in the film because he's using kind of a wider angle lens, I believe. And also just the habitat, like I said, it's a very lush, still very difficult to get to, very remote. And we also got to see the approximate location where Jerry Crew found the Bigfoot tracks around his bulldozer back in 1958, which is kind of how the whole Bigfoot thing was born. And so that was kind of cool to visit that spot, which is actually fairly close to where the film site is.
I think it is one of those things that we've got this idea of Bluff Creek, Ken, that we imagine it's going to look exactly the same, despite the fact that it's 55 years ago. And I know, having seen some of the work the Bluff Creek guys did, there was a real big flood there a few years ago as well, which brought loads of dead trees down, and the whole area was scattered and covered over. It seems like we just seem often to forget that we're talking about a site in as you say, a very difficult location in regards to getting up there and trekking out there and camping even. So it's remarkable the amount of work that those guys have done to pull it together, and because they've done a lot of work in regards to tidying it up as well, haven't they?
Yes. In fact, that was one of the obligations that we had when we joined them down there, was they put us to work with our machetes, kind of hacking away for a little while, because you'd have to keep the trails clear, access clear, and so forth. Yeah, you make a great point. The habitat is, I think, still fairly impressive. Now, one thing that's important to point out is that the Bluff Creek Project for years have been putting out lots of trail cameras in that area. And part of the sort of the July gathering, which we were a part of, is to go out and collect those trail cameras that have been up for about a year or whatever. They have not so far gotten a photograph of a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch on any of those dozens of trail cams that have been set up all over the area. So that, that's significant, I think, in terms of making an argument that, although we think there very well may have been Bigfoots or Sasquatches in that area at one time, it's hard to say if they're still there.
Yeah, I think this is often the big question, because even when we talk about animals in the natural world, Ken, if things disturb them or there are ecological changes to their environment, they will move away regardless. And even if you want to sort of say, oh, well, you're clutching at straws in regards to it defending the existence of Bigfoot, you only have to look at how animals react in the natural world to changes around them that we know of. It would be, I think, rather ignorant to presume that if we are talking about some kind of biological creature, that they would just carry on regardless of all the challenges that the environment has faced over the last 50 years. Why wouldn't they move?
Yeah, that's true. Well, there have been some bad forest fires up in that area. I don't know about Bluff Creek specifically, but Willow Creek was threatened by a pretty bad fire a year or two ago, and some people almost had to evacuate the town. So, that's been a real environmental catastrophe, particularly in the western U.S., the amount of forest fires, the size and destruction of the forest fires in recent years, that would certainly displace all kinds of animals into other areas. So, it's hard to say. There's been a long-held hypothesis that Bigfoot moves around, that it's a nomadic species. But I've had recent discussions with other researchers that are basically taking the other side of that argument now and saying, no, I don't think they do move. I think they generally will find a good area where they have a lot of resources, and they'll stay in those areas. At least that's what some of the data suggests. People that have studied particular areas over long periods of time find that the activity in those areas is pretty consistent.
I have noticed, keeping my eye on all things based in North America, primarily a lot more since I've been doing this show, Ken, it seems that a lot of the very well-known Bigfoot locations have suffered some kind of fire. I know Ape Canyon had one recently, where Ron Moorhead had his experience. That was threatened by fire, and when he went up there, he was amazed to discover that the area they'd camped in had somehow miraculously survived, and they'd got a big ring of burnt woodland around them, and yet that particular area seemed to, by chance or the change of wind, had simply managed to miss out. So it is one of those things, once again, that I think often we don't really take into consideration when we think about this. And the challenges California seems to face every year, sadly, with forest fires is something that's only going to get worse, tragically.
Yeah, it is. I guess there's not much of a silver lining there, I don't think, except that you might be able to, infer that maybe the possibility of discovering something like Bigfoot, the odds might be better now if these things are being displaced out of sort of deeper wilderness areas, that, maybe we'll get that opportunity to find definitive proof somehow, whether it's an actual body or, just someone getting just a video or something that's just undeniable. But, we'll see. I certainly would rather that the habitat stays intact. I'm an outdoor guy, an outdoorsman, and I love camping and just going out and being in nature. So it's, that's really the true benefit of being a cryptid investigator, is having a chance to go out and sort of explore a lot of these remarkable wilderness areas.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the unsung benefits of it all. There are a lot of people don't appreciate sometimes, I think, especially if they're new to it, Ken, and I think once you've got a few years under your belt, you realise that regardless of the fact that you're out there looking for certain cryptids, you are in some of the most beautiful parts of the world in regards to the scenery and everything else there. Yes,
absolutely. I think the worst day of a Bigfoot researcher is actually generally a pretty nice camping trip somewhere. So there's really no downside there.
Absolutely. And especially, I know, I seem to notice as well that Texas, in regards to Bigfoot, seems to be continuing to build its reputation. I've obviously recently spoken with Lyle, talking about his latest book, and had the opportunity since we last spoke to speak to Shelley Covington Montana as well. Mm-hmm. It seems that the Big Thicket area is continuing to drum up some reports and witnesses consistently these days.
Yes. A lot of people are not aware of the fact that Texas traditionally has a lot of Bigfoot reports from the eastern part of the state. In fact, I think we rank 7th of all the states in terms of the number of sightings annually. Mm-hmm. Now, the vast majority of those are kind of in that eastern sector, which includes the so-called Big Thicket, Sam Houston National Forest, Davy Crockett National Forest, Angelina National Forest, and then extending upward into northeastern Texas, Caddo Lake and surrounding areas, and actually spills over into sort of the northwest corner of Louisiana, southwest Arkansas, in the area around Boggy Creek. And then southeast Oklahoma has become a real hotspot or hotbed of activity in recent years in the Kiamichi and Ouachita Mountains there. So, if you go out and visit that habitat, it'll make perfect sense. There are typically there are rivers. We were talking about water sources earlier, and we have the Trinity River going all the way up. Seems to be a pretty hot quadrant, Sabine River and so forth. So a lot of piney woods. For whatever reason, it's been determined that Bigfoot or Sasquatches are more likely to be found in areas that have coniferous trees, pine trees. And we do have a lot of those. They're certainly not the giant sequoias of the Pacific Northwest, but if you travel throughout the Big Thicket and some of those piney forests of East Texas, there are a number of conifer trees up there. So, Texas certainly has a lot to offer in terms of Bigfoot. Now, I live, of course, down in San Antonio in south central Texas, which we do not have a lot of habitat that would be conducive to a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, I think. But I do get a number of lately I've been getting a few reports here and there of areas up here in the so-called hill country, which I live at the edge of, which is in terms of Texas is fairly uninhabited, and it's kind of rolling hills and lots of caves and underwater aquifers that kind of spring up into springs and things like that. So But it's, certainly again, not quite as dense as, as East Texas. And that's where I would expect the most sightings to come from.
Fascinating. I must admit, I'm always intrigued when I hear these, usually because there's something about certain people, Ken, and where they live in which particular state, that if you get a report from certain witnesses, and I know you've spoken with people like this in the past, where you've got these guys who've spent their entire lives out in the woods and they have an encounter and that's it, they've done. And usually if I hear a Texan telling me that they're scared to go somewhere, regardless of what they're carrying, I give that a lot more credence than some perhaps other witnesses I hear from.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Now that can actually go in two different directions. I have interviewed hunters, or ex-hunters, I should say, that have had Bigfoot encounters, and as you say, they generally, they'll lose their appetite to go out in the woods anymore. They're kind of spooked, if you will, and they'll oftentimes sell all their guns and say, "That's it, I'm done." But I have some colleagues where it had the opposite effect, and they had an encounter, and it basically became an all-consuming sort of life passion to try to find definitive evidence of these things. And they spend all their time out in the woods looking now. So yeah, but the bottom line is that, and I've never had a visual sighting of a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, Paul. I think I've stated that many times. I'm convinced I've heard them, at close range, but these are very profound experiences, and particularly people that have seen them, it seems to really sort of shake the foundation of people's perception of reality, and what they've kind of grown up with believing or thinking is out in the woods. Now, one qualifier to that is that I think there is a tendency for many people to want to, what I call, monsterize Bigfoot and turn it into this horrible ogre that lives out in the woods that's basically looking to abduct women and small children and so on and so forth. I think they're just basically very rare, very elusive animals, and no more dangerous than any other wild animal. So,
Absolutely. I think with anything, you've got to remember, if we are talking about an animal, we're talking about a wild animal, Ken, and I think, as with anything, certain animals will react in certain circumstances in a certain way. So I would imagine it all depends on the interaction and how you come across them in such regard that you would get a specific reaction which may lend it to be a more negative experience.
Well, that's true. But this is a great exercise in terms of critical thinking. If Bigfoot was out to get us, so to speak, if it was regularly, consistently hunting humans for whatever reason, wouldn't we know for sure that it existed by now?
Yes.
I don't think there's any way. Certainly at some point there would have been, an attack that was observed by multiple people, or bodies that were being found that Bigfoot was not able to cache for whatever reason. So yeah, but the only real accounts you have of aggression on record are, of course, the famous 8 Canyon incident, where allegedly they shot one of these things first. So you can imagine that would be a retaliation of some kind. The famous Teddy Roosevelt Bauman story, which is really just an old story that comes secondhand, and we don't know if that was a Bigfoot or not. So yeah, I don't view them as overly dangerous. Certainly they should be, like all animals, should be respected, though. You don't want to do anything foolish or, put yourself in jeopardy. So
absolutely. I mean, that's a very fair point, because, this world creates situations where we will hear remarkable stories from people who have survived animal attacks, which on another day they would have died. There are people that have survived being attacked by grizzly bears, by polar bears even. I remember once hearing a lady who was attacked by a polar bear, which is one of the most frightening witness accounts of anything I've ever heard in my life. And she was just walking home from the pub and it just jumped her. And she managed to, I think she poked it in the eye and got away. Gosh. But it was shaking her about like a rag doll. She got away, survived. She had a lot of stitches and she made a full recovery, thankfully. But so that's a very fair point that I think often gets overlooked when we're talking about these aggressive encounters, that people survive horrific attacks by wild animals. So why do we not, if they are doing what some people are claiming they are doing, it's a very valid point that somebody somewhere would have survived it, surely.
Yeah, that's a great. And by the way, that's fascinating. I can't imagine anything more terrifying than encountering a polar bear in the wild, and the fact that someone was able to survive an attack. That certainly is. That's certainly quite miraculous. But now we should add that there are certainly many accounts of Bigfoot displaying aggressive, what I think is basically territorial sort of demonstrations, and that by that I mean like these the rock throwing. A lot of people have reported these big rocks flying at them from out of the woods, which is certainly dangerous. But fortunately, no one I know has been conked on the head yet. There seem to be a lot of screaming, yelling, and aggressive sounds. The bad stench that is often associated with Bigfoot could potentially be some type of defense mechanism or warning that these animals are emitting. And people that live in rural areas often describe like something that bangs on the side of the house. It's all very terrifying. I can understand why that would be quite unnerving to deal with any of that. But, again, sensibly speaking, we could explain all of that by saying that, these animals certainly don't want us around. And, that, like any other animal, they may defend their territory with these kind of aggressive displays.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think it's one of those things you just got to try and unpick it without getting too bogged down in one particular train of thought with this, as you say, about critical thinking, and sort of take a step back and say, well, is that really are they really as bad as some people say? So it's a fair point. I know, as I was joking with you earlier before we started, Ken, it's always good to see you on TV, and you're always appearing over here in the UK quite a lot. And one of my favourite shows that I've grown to love since it started is The Unexplained with William Shatner. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, recently you appeared on an episode diving into one of your particular favourite topics, and one of mine as well, because obviously it's very close to home, and probably I would suggest the most famous weird cryptid encounter in Western Europe that anybody knows, despite the fact it's over 250 years ago now. So it seems to have taken on a life of its own, which is the Beast of Gevaudan. But I remember hearing you speak about people talking about, because there's a lot of theories put forward in regards to this, of all kinds of things, which we'll dive into a second. But I had to chuckle recently when I heard you talking about dogmen and werewolves. And I've noticed this trend as well, is that certain people will not entertain the idea that dogmen are werewolves and vice versa. They seem to be two very distinctly different species, Ken.
Yeah, that's it's an interesting discussion that is had in the dogman community, those enthusiasts, eyewitnesses, and researchers that are fascinated in that topic. The argument that I always hear in terms of why dogman is not a werewolf is that the traditional European werewolf, of course, is a shapeshifter, and many different traditions of people basically making a pact with the devil. And of course, as far as I know, most of this happened a long time ago in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, where, people would make a pact with the devil, and it was some type of witchcraft that often involved an animal pelt or a magical ointment or something. And so essentially a werewolf was not a full-time, an individual was not a werewolf all the time. It was just something that he would occasionally turn into during a full moon or whatever. So the argument made for dogman is that, that this is not a shape-shifting creature, that it is in fact a full-time half man, half canid type creature. And you could also consider that, the traditional European werewolves, I don't think, were bipeds. They weren't said to walk up on their hind legs. They were often four-legged creatures. It's very similar to the native wolf population, but often larger and possessing some strange characteristics. So I don't know, but there are more accounts apparently of the dogman creatures going down on all four legs. That's something I've learned in talking to Linda Godfrey and other researchers, that does seem to be something that they do. There are a couple of dogman accounts that I've investigated recently where people claim to have found a pile of discarded clothing nearby, which is kind of like someone had stripped down and then run off into the woods. So I don't know. It's certainly a fascinating discussion to be had. from my perspective, and, I always tell people that in the zoological world, I tend to be a splitter. That is, I like to talk about how animals are different and speciation with different types of subspecies and things like that. I think it's fun to kind of split those animals up. But in the world of cryptozoology, I tend to be more of a lumper. And so I tend to look at things, in terms of, there's certainly, it seems highly improbable that something like a werewolf exists. It seems equally improbable that something like Dogman exists. It seems impossible that both of those would exist. So I think the safe route there would be to, they seem to be similar enough to where they probably represent the same phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah, very. Like you were saying about that pile of clothes, it could have been lunch for all we know, Ken. I mean, it depends how badly torn the clothes were. So we're in a neat pile, who knows? But if they're sort of strewn about, that sadly could have been the end of someone.
Yeah, these were neatly folded, I think. So they're probably, as far as I know, unless the Dogman threatened them, and said, "Remove your clothing and put them in a neat pile if you know what's good for you."
Stranger things have happened, Ken. So, getting back to the Beast of Gevaudan, I have to say, Ken, the thing that always annoys me about this particular case is that there will always be people who will just simply go, well, it was clearly a serial killer. And you think, well, you've clearly not really looked into this. Because the thing about the beast is that people somehow survived it. Mm-hmm. And it's remarkable for me that when people try to dismiss these stories, I mean, it's not a story. This is a factual event that occurred over a 3-year period in this particular region of France. That some people try and dismiss the number of people that died. Some people claim it was this. Some people claim it was that. And yet this serial killer thing keeps popping up, which for me makes absolutely no sense if you've actually read the case properly, because all the witnesses that survived clearly describe some kind of animal that attacked them.
Well, that's true. And, I think one proponent to the serial killer theory was the late, great French cryptozoologist Jean-Jacques Barlois, who I got to work with. Sadly, he did not make it into the documentary that we did. I thought he brought a lot to the table, but he had been investigating the beast for, he was based out of Paris, but he had been investigating the beast for many years, the beast accounts, and had a computer database he'd put together. And based on his profile, he tended to lean towards the serial killer theory. But you're right, there were survivors. Most notable was a young man named Jacques Portefeuille. He organized a counterattack on the beast when it apparently came out and was going to attack about 7 or 8 children. They wielded sticks, threw rocks, and managed to fend off the beast. And they certainly didn't describe it as a human. They said it was this wolf-like animal. There was also a young lady named Marie Jean Velay, the Maiden of Gevaudan.
Yes.
There's a famous statue memorializing her. She had a lance, a long spear, and she fended off the beast. There were also hunters. There were many accounts of the wolf hunters that Louis XV and others had deployed. Duhamel was, I think, the first hunter of the beast. He was the head of the dragoons that were out there looking. Later on, a guy named Deneval, a wolf hunter. There were some encounters where they supposedly had come across the beast and shot at it, but just, weren't able to tag and bag it, if you will. So the thing ran off into the woods. So there were certainly a lot of eyewitnesses that survived, and also people that had seen it or encountered it or shot at it. And you're right, it was clearly an animal. That's what people were describing. Was not an animal they were familiar with based on the accounts and descriptions. They were certainly very familiar with wolves at that time in that region of southern France. Wolves were very prevalent. Wolf attacks at that time were more prevalent than they are in modern times. In fact, I think there have been like 9,000 documented wolf attacks on humans in France over the centuries. So people were familiar with wolves and wolf attacks, and this was always represented as being something entirely different.
Yeah. I think, once again, this is one of those things that people just either misunderstand or don't appreciate, that it's only in the modern era that wolves are not as prevalent as they were in that part of Europe. I know recently I was reading an article about that some people are claiming that there are issues in the Netherlands which is probably one of those places that you never expect wolves to turn up, because they've obviously, as Europe has become more open-minded and dealing with supporting nature in all its facets, Ken, wolves have sort of rebounded dramatically over the last 30 years all across Western Europe, from Italy and Germany and Austria, and sort of, as they would do, have begun to migrate back west as they normally would have done. So I think people just seem to imagine that wolves were very rare in those days, and yet it's quite clear when you look at that particular period of time, wolves and bears and other creatures of that ilk were everywhere across Western Europe at that period, and it was only sort of the 18th and 19th centuries that they began to sort of try and eradicate them as say, people moved into farming and looking after livestock, and therefore it became a financial necessity, didn't it?
Yes, that's a good point. And it seems like wolves have evolved and now have a healthier respect, of the danger of attacking humans. I think a lot of that coincided with how they became familiar with guns. Yes. We're able to pass somehow genetically that message down to their descendants that humans are very dangerous because we can shoot them. Certainly you have to consider the fact that the hunter Jean Chastel did ultimately shoot a strange animal in 1767 that was considered to be the beast. Sadly, we do not have the remains. They seem to have vanished, as is often the case in cryptozoological mysteries. But certainly anyone familiar with cryptozoology, this is probably not a spoiler, but there is a theory out there that this animal was in fact a hyena that had either been let loose or escaped. The best evidence, I think, for that is the fact that there was a mounted animal on display in Paris in the early 19th century, late 18th century, that was called the Beast of Gevaudan, and that this particular mount seemed to represent a hyena of some kind. Very recently, there is a book that has come out called Beast, and I'm embarrassed, I can't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but it kind of reintroduces the theory that the Beast of Gevaudan was in fact a lion, similar to the Tsavo lions, which killed hundreds of people in Africa, and certainly if you're looking at the number of people that were allegedly attacked or killed by this animal, whatever it was, you would have to sort of explain why any animal would go out of its way to attack so many humans. And I guess you could make the strongest argument for something like a lion, having a highly, once it had tasted human flesh, so to speak, having kind of adapted that type of behavior. So, I don't know, Paul, it's a fascinating mystery. Like you said, it's 250 years on now. Certainly, I think that there is an actual animal involved. I don't think it was merely a serial killer. But like with many of cryptids, it could be one of these cases of what, Carl Schuker calls composite identity, where you have, perhaps an actual mystery animal at the root of it, but then you do have mass hysteria, misidentification, hoaxes, and perhaps somewhere embedded in all of that mass hysteria, there may have been a serial killer that simply used the opportunity, if you will, to go about some, and then, that certainly could have added to the casualty count. So who knows?
Absolutely. It would make sense to me, Ken, that. Yeah,
certainly. We can't downplay that aspect of human nature. And I think that's another fascinating sort of component of the Beast of Gevaudan mysteries. It kind of encompasses a lot of these different theories, old werewolf traditions marked with kind of the French Revolution and power struggles in France between the Roman Catholic Church and the monarchy. And so it makes for a great story, a great saga.
Yeah, very much so. I have to say, I recently watched a documentary about the Tsavo lions, and I was stunned to discover that they reckon the reason that they decided that they were going to hunt these construction workers on the railway is that one of them had a bad tooth and it couldn't open its mouth properly to take down its normal prey, and decided that was the best thing to do, was to go for the softer, slower human, and another lion saw what it was doing and copied it.
Oh, it's fascinating.
And I was, I didn't
sense.
Because I think the skeletons are in the States, and somebody did a analysis of the skull of one of them, and it's clearly got a broken tooth. So that would certainly explain, like you said, but wow, can you imagine how terrifying it would have been to these were railroad workers, right? Were most of the victims, so that would have certainly entitled them to some kind of bonus or raise, I would assume, at that time. I don't know how the employer handled that, but well, I was going to say, I'm not really sure what you could do in those days. I mean, I was going to say raise, you'd want to be up in a tree, but we all know that that's not really going to protect you either.
Probably not.
So, I mean, this is the thing about the beast, because of what we know about how animals are, and the Savo lion is probably one of the best examples of a large cat targeting humans. This is the other weird thing about it, Ken, is that as I mentioned about the agriculture and the livestock aspect of Europe at that particular period in time, these animals would have had an abundant source of natural resources, and that alone is one of those things that marks this case out as rather peculiar, because why did it decide to start targeting people regardless of what it was? I think that's the other aspect, because everything around them, we're talking about beautiful, unspoilt lands at that period of time with wild animals running freely. So there would have been plenty of sheep and goats and cows. There would have been plenty of natural resources for it. And this is the other aspect that's always intrigued me about, because it just started out of nowhere and it was such a sort of blitz of 3 years of attacks before an animal was allegedly killed, though obviously everything seemed to stop after that point. That's one of the other aspects of this, is that whatever it was, even if, do hyenas have a history of attacking humans? Because that's the other thing, that I understand the descriptions and the way people describe the attack method of this creature to be very similar to a hyena, but I think most people would not consider a hyena, as daft as this sounds, Ken, I don't think people would consider a hyena as a creature that a human would fear. Do you know what I mean? Because they're not they're certainly not the size of a wolf, perhaps.
Well, there are 4 species of hyenas. The spotted hyenas, which are the largest, can actually get pretty big. We've got a couple at the zoo, and they're certainly something that I would run from if I saw it. But the smaller hyenas, like the brown hyena, which is what the Beast of Gevaudan seem to most resemble, are actually very small and are typically scavengers, not active predators. So you bring up a good point there. I think the real mystery, now we should point out that this particular period in France was during a time that is now referred to as the Little Ice Age. So the winters were particularly brutal and harsh, although it seems like many of the attacks actually occurred during the summer months. So, on the one hand, you could make an argument that maybe animals, if the resources were not quite as abundant as normal because of these brutally cold winters, but you hit a very key point there, which is that the amount of livestock was very prevalent. And in fact, many of the victims of the Beast of Gevaudan were supposedly women and children that were tending to herds of sheep or cattle or other. And why were the livestock never attacked? At least in terms of the research I've done, I haven't found any accounts of the Beast of Gevaudan allegedly attacking any of this abundant livestock, nor any livestock animals being found mutilated after the fact. So the fact that it was targeting in on humans is pretty significant and very unusual behavior. And to your other point, hyenas actually, from my research, are generally more aggressive than wild dogs, wolves, and so forth. They in Africa, I think I don't know the current numbers, but I think statistically there's still quite a number of attacks on people by hyenas. So they do tend to be slightly more aggressive than other types of predators out there, but still certainly nowhere near, I think, where you could say that one or even a couple or a few animals would go on a killing spree over 3 years and attack and kill upwards of 60 to 100 people. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And the fact that I think a lot of people also reported that they seem to see one creature as well, Ken, because often I know people sometimes say, oh, well, it might be a few of them or a group of them. But we never hear that kind of, as far as I'm aware, Ken, nobody seemed to report multiple creatures.
No, I'm not aware of any accounts of multiple creatures with regard to the Beast of Gevaudan. And in fact, I'm only aware out of the hundreds of documented reports of only one or two eyewitnesses describing it as walking upright on its hind legs, which, I think is a pretty small sample size. And so it really shouldn't be considered. But to those people out there that would try to make that case that the Beast of Gevaudan was a type of werewolf or dogman type creature way back when, it didn't seem to really fit the description of what people are just, talking about in terms of dogman reports or even traditional werewolf stories and legends.
Yeah. Well, for me, the werewolf angle is a non-starter because everybody was attacked in the day. And it wasn't always on a full moon, Ken. So surely that alone would negate that argument, would it not?
Yeah, good point. Although the interesting takeaway is, of course, that Jean Chastel, the hunter that shot the Beast of Gevaudan, apparently had these silver bullets that he had specially made and blessed by a priest. And so thanks to that particular circumstance, we now have silver bullets popping up in every werewolf movie that we watch, which is good for me. I don't mind that.
No, absolutely. And I would always recommend, I think my favourite interpretation of this particular story is that wonderful Canadian-French film Brotherhood of the Wolf that came out about 20 years ago, which is obviously a very interesting angle about it being somebody's entertainment out of their menagerie, which is always the other argument of why it suddenly appeared, Ken, that it was some rich landowner's pet that got free and they couldn't recapture it.
Yeah, that seems to be a reasonable, at least for some of the accounts. Again, I don't know if you could explain all of the attacks with one, particularly when you look at the range of habitat, and there's a map, or I had a map that I made with all the accounts marked, and you would sometimes have two accounts or two alleged attacks in the same day, hundreds of miles apart or at least dozens of miles apart. So that wouldn't make sense either for just one animal, but who knows?
Yeah, no, it's still fascinating. Great. All these years on.
Truly.
So what's coming up for you next, Ken? I know you're having some downtime and some rest. I know you're still working at San Antonio and doing your education work there for the visitors. So what else is on your plate, and have you got anything exciting planned for next year after your hectic year? Oh,
well, thanks again for having me on, Paul. Always a pleasure to speak with you, my friend. Right now I'm helping some other researchers put some books and materials together. I'm finally following up on some cryptid accounts and reports that I've received over the past year or so. Different people have reached out to me with sightings of typical Bigfoot, some thunderbirds, some other interesting things. As far as expeditions for next year, I will be collaborating with Extreme Expeditions Northwest, which is a group that sponsors different Bigfoot, Sasquatch expeditions in the Pacific Northwest, and we're going to be doing something up in British Columbia next year. So,
fabulous!
This is evidently a pretty good area that has a long tradition and history, and many of the native people there have talked about encountering these creatures up there. So that's about it at the moment, my friend. Just kind of retooling, recalibrating, if you will, and deciding what I want to do next year.
Oh, fabulous. Well, I'm extremely jealous as usual, Ken, when I hear about your expeditions, going to some of the most beautiful parts of the world. So, that sounds fantastic. Have you been into British Columbia before, Ken?
Yes, and I was there in 2014. I did a small investigation up in the Garibaldi Range, which is about 50 or 60 miles north of Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And that particular range was one of the favorite locations for René de Hinden, who was, of course, one of the the original Four Horsemen of Bigfoot research. He would go up into that area quite a bit. But sadly, I have not yet made it to the area around Harrison and Hot Springs and the Sasquatch Provincial Park, which is, kind of where it all started in the 1920s in terms of J.W. Burns and the Chehalis Sasquatch stories that began to come out of the stories there. So I'd love to make it up there to some of those locations someday in that. And also eastern British Columbia, you have a place called Mika Mountain, which is where William Rowe had a pretty famous sighting of a Bigfoot back in 1955. So that's been on my bucket list for a while now as well. So we'll see.
Fabulous. So do you know how long your itinerary is up there, Ken? You're going to have a couple of weeks, hopefully?
Yeah, probably a week or two, depending on the logistics of this area. It's evidently very remote, so it's gonna, it's kind of way up there on the British Columbia coast. So we'll see, but hopefully we can get a week or two in.
Brilliant. Well, Ken, as you mentioned, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I'm sorry it's been so long. And where can everybody keep up to date with your work and follow you online?
Oh, well, thanks again, Paul. I have a website, kengerhard.com. It's badly in need of a facelift, and that's another thing I'll be working on this year. But you can certainly go there. And I also am on all the social media platforms, the main ones at least, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And I also have a YouTube channel, just kind of a small channel where I occasionally post videos of different cryptid investigations and things.
Fabulous. Well, Ken, it's been a pleasure. I promise it won't be 18 months till I get in touch again. Thank you for your time, your conversation, and your humility as always. Thank you.
Sounds good, Paul. Take care. We'll talk soon.